Okay, good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are in the world. Good evening for some people. Welcome to the fourth session of the Sunoikissis Digital Classics Autumn 2021 program, which is mostly focused around text encoding and digital philology and digital linguistics. For today's session, I and my colleague Scott DiGiulio from Mississippi State University, I believe, are going to talk, and we're going to give the second of two sessions on text encoding. You had a session 2 weeks ago from myself and Paulina Urdanova from Helsinki, talking about using EpiDoc to encode the text of an ancient object, and this session is going to be talking about the object, encoding information about the object, so the history and physical description of the object and so forth. And Scott in a moment will tell you a little more about what this session is going to cover. Just a word of welcome both to people watching live, especially to any students who are watching. My students in London, Monica's students in Leipzig. Monica obviously isn't here today, but I believe her students are still joining us. And also welcome to anybody who's watching this non-live, asynchronously at any point in the future. We want these things to remain available, and you know, we've open licensed all of these materials so people can use these in teaching and learning at any point in the future. If you are watching live, please use the live chat feature, which is usually to the right of the YouTube video or below it, just to say hi in the first instance, but also and tell us, you know, where you are, where you're watching from. Also, if you have any questions or comments at any point throughout the session, and especially at the end, we'll have a little bit of discussion on sort of bigger principles. Please do join in with those comments there. That would be extremely useful. I see there's one question in the live chat already at the moment, a question concerning the Leipzig sessions in December. Are these planned to be online as well? I think if you're referring to the last two sessions on the program on GitHub, which currently say Leipzig only to be added, yes, those will be online, the same as all the rest. They just haven't been added yet. By Leipzig only, what we really meant, that was just a placeholder for the fact that that there are several institutions teaching over this semester using the Sunoikisis Digital Classics sessions for that, but some of those sessions stop after the beginning of the first session in December. The Leipzig ones carry on for a couple of weeks more. So my direct interest sort of ends after that first one, and Monica is in charge of the ones thereafter. So that's all that meant. There'll be no difference to you once they've been added. You don't need to worry about, you know, whether it's a Leipzig only session or not. I hope that answers your question. So hi to all the people from both Leipzig and London who are already saying hi in the chat, and people anywhere else in the world for that matter. Let's press on with this session. There's a link below the YouTube video to the session page for this, the Sunoikissis Digital Classics session page, which will have some bibliographies, place where you can download the slides and a few other things. I will hand over now to my colleague Scott, who will tell you a little bit about this session, and then you'll hear from both of us sort of alternatingly over the course of the session as well.
Awesome, great, thanks, Gabby. Hello, everyone. As Gabby said, my name is Scott DiGiulio. We're going to be talking a bit today about talking about your objects in terms of what we would broadly call descriptive metadata. We'll say a little more about what that means in a second. For those who want to pull up a copy of the slide deck, you can also use the URL at the bottom right of the first slide here. You should be able to get a copy of it there as well. So what are we going to be talking about today? Broadly, we're going to talk about the information about the object on which a text is inscribed using the broad principles of EpiDoc. Really, we can divide this into kind of two broad categories of things. So 1 through 3 on this slide here, basically talking about description of the manuscript, dating and locations. What this ultimately means is what we would probably want to call historical information or historical metadata. And then 4 through 6, we would probably want to describe as descriptive metadata. So we would talk about the shape of the object or the kind of object, what the text looks like, how it's been executed. And we can talk a little bit also about the actual handwriting or the stonecutters marks and things like that in terms of description of hands. So that's our broad overview. We will kind of take them in the order as they appear here. So we'll focus first on general issues of manuscript description, move on to the historical metadata, and then move to the more descriptive material about what we see when we look at the object. Just a quick notice, we're getting going to give credit where credit is due. The slides that we'll be using are based on work by Eli Milonos, Pietro Liuzzo, Simona Stoyanova, Irene Vagianakis, Polina Yordanova, and others. You can access all of the slide decks, including further information about some of the material that we'll be talking about today that's been condensed a little bit, at the URL on the slide here. This is where all of the tutorials for working with EpiDoc live. And again, there will be in some of those slide decks a little more information than we've included in the slides today. So if you find your interest in some of this piqued, or you think that you'd like to go into a little further detail on some of it, a good first port of call would be to check out the fuller slide decks at the tutorial link there. Okay, so to begin, manuscript description. What we're talking about when we say manuscript description is we're talking about a particular part of the document, our EpiDoc document, and where we're going to put this information in terms of describing information, historical, physical, and otherwise, about the manuscript, text, or inscription that we're looking at. Okay, as a kind of reminder, I think this is something that was brought up in the previous session, but the EpiDoc document itself is divided into 3 kind of broad areas. We have the TEI header, which is where metadata is contained, things about the source, the transcription, et cetera, et cetera. There's a facsimile section where we would include information about any images that you are including and connecting to your files. And then we have the text field, which is the description of the text itself, the actual commentary and transcription. What we're going to focus on today are things that go into the TEI header, right? And keeping that in mind, what we're really interested in is the kind of information that we see here in these 2 inscriptions outputs. So information about, say, the fact that if we're looking at the top left, right, that it's a fragment, that we have its dimensions, we know historically when it is from. We have something about the layout, we have find spot and original location and all of this stuff. This is actually the meat of what we're going to talk about today and the kind of information that we care most about, right? So ultimately, this material will go into a structure within your file that belongs in the TEI header and all falls under the kind of broader rubric here of the MS desk, right? The manuscript description. So as you can see, if we're looking here, there's a whole bunch of different things that we can include here, and we'll talk about a bunch of them. Physical descriptions, object descriptions, like what kind of type it is, support. We could include things like material and layout. We could talk about the hand, and we can talk about the history of the object itself. Okay, and what we'll ultimately want to do is, again, cover the historical information first, even though it kind of comes later in the file structure. Okay, and with that, I think I can hand off to Gabby, who will talk a bit about what to do when you want to mark up your dating.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Scott. So yes, I'm going to talk about the dating an inscription. And in this case, we're talking about one of these features in the history that Scott mentioned, which is the origin of the object of the inscribed object, or papyrus, or manuscript, or whatever kind of text object is being described. The main things described under origin, as you can see in this snippet of XML here, are the original place and the original date, the date of origin. And what we're focusing on for the moment, Scott will talk about place in a minute, but what I'm focusing on for the moment is the date in that section. And so that orig date element that represents that date can contain some kind of description of the date of the kind that you would normally see in an edition. This can be safely ascribed to the 3rd century BCE. But we can also make that more explicit for purposes of searching and indexing and other processing, and by adding attributes to that orig date element. So, for example, in the case of saying this can safely be ascribed to the 3rd century BCE, we can say that what does 3rd century BCE means? Well, in numerical terms, that means somewhere between -300, that is 300 BCE, and -201, that is 201 BCE. One might argue that that is too concrete. When I say this can safely be ascribed to the 3rd century BC, I don't mean that it could be from the 1st of January 300, but could not be from the 31st of December 301. Right? That's a sort of spurious exactitude, as I was once very correctly rebuked at a conference when presenting something like this. So what we want to also say then is that there's a certain element of precision. There are some occasions where I will say this inscription could be from 238, but could not be from 239. But and so there you would want to say I have high precision. But in this case, we want to say 300 to 201 are, while we're fairly sure about that span, those dates are arbitrary beginning and ends of that span, right? So we say precision equals medium. That's just a sort of convention that EpiDoc has adopted for saying that. And so there's the three values that we can use for precision. We could say precision equals high, although I've crossed that out because we don't actually say that. If we are absolutely sure, or even pretty sure, that that's the number we mean, we don't bother putting in a precision attribute. So that's sort of a default value. Precision is medium means this is an arbitrary block of dates, such as a century, and precision equals low would mean this is an approximate date. It's a circa date, which is a slightly different thing from an arbitrary block of dates. Again, this is a slightly conventional use of these attributes because approximate isn't actually less precise than an arbitrary thing necessarily, but we just use the two values to represent those different kinds of date. Similarly, we could have a date which is a lot more specific. So we know the exact ancient year of this inscription, but the ancient year started and finished on a different date than our year. So we say something like December 11th, year 20 to December 10th, year 19 BCE. And again, there we can put the entire date in the not before and not after attributes. And this date if we use the not before and not after attributes, this date should be a date in the Gregorian calendar. Which when we say December 11th, year 20 BCE, we're probably not talking about the proleptic Gregorian calendar. As a classicist, you're probably talking about the Julian calendar. So in this case, we might, and this is more detailed than you probably care about, but we sometimes see things using this not before custom attribute, which is, this is not a customized attribute, this is a normal TEI attribute, but what the custom refers to is that the dating method is a locally defined one. And in this case, we're pointing to a definition of the Julian calendar somewhere using that dating method attribute, rather than using the Gregorian calendar as is required if this was an ISO date in the not before attribute and not after attribute. Likewise, when we're talking about other spans that aren't necessarily full centuries. So we don't necessarily want to say a whole century. We can say late 4th century. 367 to 400 is equally as arbitrary as an entire century. So again, we use the precision medium there. And we have dating criteria there. We say we're dating it to the late 4th century by an intersection of our assessment of the lettering and of knowledge we know about from the nomenclature. In that case, if we've used the evidence attribute to say lettering and nomenclature, we don't also need to say lettering and nomenclature in prose in there. So we can delete that, and the lettering and nomenclature information from evidence can be what we present to readers. Apologies for the sudden change in color in the middle of that slide there. EpiDoc does suggest a certain number of possible values for evidence that you can use, and you can stack these and use them multiply. But it's also, as represented by the 3 dots at the bottom of that list, it's an open list. You can use any values that are useful to you if the values on the list don't cover what you want to say for the kind of criteria you're using in dating your inscription. So just a couple of concrete examples. We have an inscription that's internally dated to 212 CE. So we can say when 212, so we don't need to say not before or not after because it's all within a single year. The evidence is internal. Second example, we have an internal date which gives you the full date, so year 111, the 21st day of Faofi, which is an ancient month. By year 111, they presumably mean that in a different dating system. This is not the Gregorian or Julian dating system. So we've said that where the text says year 111, 21 Faofi, that would be, in our terms, the 18th of October, 80 CE. So we can say this is the 18th of October, 80 CE based on internal evidence. But we could also say, and we also mean that this is in the Julian calendar, because when we translate Faofi to 21st of Faofi to 18th of October, we're doing so according to the proleptic Julian calendar, not to the proleptic Gregorian calendar. So we're still using that when custom attribute there. The third example, this is slightly different way of handling dates. If you say this inscription is clearly from the first generation after Caracalla's citizenship edict, because of nomenclature, the sort of dating we're talking about, the citizenship edict was from 212. So within a generation, let's say we mean it's probably up to about 250. One could argue about when that date should be. But you see, we've got something slightly different going on than with my previous imprecise dates, in that 212 is an absolutely fixed date. This could not have been from 211 because of the nomenclature of the person in this inscription. But 250 is an approximate date. So we can't just say precision medium because the precision of the not before and the precision of the not after are different. So here, instead of using a precision attribute, we use a precision element, which points to not after and says not after has medium precision. Okay, that's what's going on there. You might want to sort of unpack that a little bit and look at the definitions of those elements to understand what's going on there. But that's what we mean. I'm saying that not before has ordinary precision, but not after has medium precision because it's an arbitrary date. And for the final example, this is just something, exactly the same sort of thing that we've seen with how to handle dates for the original date of the date of origin of an inscription. We can do with dates that are mentioned internally in the inscription. So if the inscription says this line of Latin, the third day of the calends of November, during the consulship of Gratus and Seleucus, we can date that. That reference may not be the date of the inscription at all, although presumably it was in the past. So it's a date sometime in the past from the inscription. But we nevertheless might want to say that this mentioned date is a reference to the 30th of October 221. So we use exactly the same attributes on the date element, which we were using on the org date element before. And a slightly different kind of reference. So we have a reference, maybe not in the inscription, but maybe in a prose text or maybe in the commentary to the text, where we're talking about something that takes place throughout the reign of Trajan. We're not saying it happened at one point during the reign of Trajan, which would be not before 98 and not after 117, but we're saying something happened throughout the reign of Trajan. This is a different kind of statement. So there, instead of saying not before and not after, we're saying from and to, from 98 to 0117. Okay, slightly different set of attributes with slightly different definitions there. So this slide is just summarizing what I've just said in all of the above. That we can use when, not before, or not after to record ISO dates. We can suffix any one of those attributes with the dash custom, which enables us to attach a dating method to it if we're not using the Gregorian date that ISO dates requires. We can use a precision attribute with medium or low on it. High is assumed if we don't put any precision attribute. And we can use evidence, which is a semi-constrained list. That is to say, values are suggested, but you can add further values to that. And if you want to know more about how these things work, the best place to look is in the TEI guidelines. There's a reference page to the org date element, which tells you a bit about how that works, and also to a set of attributes, the datable custom attributes, which are the ones with dash custom at the end of the attribute name, down below. And if you're really interested in how dates and dating work with relation to ancient texts and digital publication of ancient texts, you might be interested in the Godot project, godot.date, which is all about recording ancient dates in texts. And I think I'll hand over to Scott to talk about locations.
Awesome, great. So like Gabby said, let's turn to talking about locations. So we have covered, where our objects are from, or how, or when they're from, and how we are going to deal with dates, both kind of external to them. That is to say, if we are giving its original date, or even if we're dealing with dates mentioned in the text. In terms of talking about locations, there's actually going to be a number of different locations that we might want to include. This will include the original location, but we also might want to talk about the find spot. We might want to talk about the last recorded or modern location of it, where it's seen today, a present repository, or dates mentioned in text. So we're going to be covering a kind of range of different kinds of locations here. They all operate pretty similarly, so they make sense to be grouped together like this. So here we have a kind of XML snippet detailing the history of a particular inscription. It's going to be our kind of model for layering this information and thinking about, okay, how am I going to indicate my different place features here? So if we're just looking at this again, just to get a quick overview, right? So we have our origin up here. We have the original place, the org place, which we'll start from. We have a date, which again, we could add the markup that Gabby had just talked about. As we see, we have some information about the provenance here in a paragraph, right? So a whole bunch of information about the history of the object post creation and post excavation. And we'll deal with each of these in sequence. Okay, so we can start with our original location. So we're in origin, right? We're starting in the origin element. Within that, we'll start with the original place, right? And we can just initially leave it as the free text. But if we want to add more specificity to indicate that we actually are going to be talking about a specific place that we've indexed, that we've produced a, perhaps a list of our own information about what the specific places that we're dealing with in our project are. We can add a ref attribute and point directly to an external authority list. So that's what's going on here in the red. We're saying that in this authority list that we've generated, we are actually dealing with place DB987, right? Which is Caesareum. The reason we do this is because different people may spell this differently. People may kind of mean the same thing, but have a slightly more capacious bit of information that they would put there. What we're trying to do is constrain specifically to say, this is the place that we're talking about. Okay. From there, we may want to then talk a bit about the history of the object after it was created, right? So again, just to step back for a second, in talking about a rig place, we're talking about where the object originally was displayed, where it lived its original life, so to speak. In terms of talking about provenance, we're going to start talking about the modern custodial history of this object. Okay, so we can go to a provenance element, and we want to first talk about its find spot. We want to say, where was it found in the modern context? So we can take provenance, we will add a type attribute, and we'll put found as our value. There are a number of suggested values for the types. I don't think I actually have a little pop-up like we did for date of the, or evidence in date of the constrained list. Suffice to say that one does exist, but one can kind of expand it. It's a suggested list rather than a fully defined list. So if we want to detail our find spot, we will say found on our provenance. It was found in Cyrene, and we want to flag that as being a place. So what we can do is we will surround Cyrene with a placeName element, and then within that we can add a whole bunch more specificity to flagging the location as a specific place. So first we can say, well, what kind of place am I talking about? The ancient find spot. So we will add a type attribute for that, and we can put in our find spot value. If we want to point to any kind of authority lists, like we said before, if we want to point to, say, an external authority list, like the Pleiades Gazetteer, we can add a ref attribute, and we'll put our link to Pleiades here, and that would say, okay, so Pleiades defines Cyrene as this place. If we have done it in our internal list, we can use a key attribute with the value that we assigned it there. So if we want to look beyond that, we can also be a little more specific again. So Cyrene is the kind of bigger place. Caesarium is the smaller place within. We can also surround Caesarium with a referring string element, the RS element, and point back to our authority list again, but this is kind of a second level thing if we are generating our own authority lists for places. If you want to include that information, this is how you would go about doing it. I don't think necessarily one needs to, but if we are trying to be as precise and constrained within our project and our markup within our projects as we can be, this is really a successful way to do it. Okay, so we've now indicated our find spot, and we've marked up our various places as we have them. We might want to indicate our dating, though, now within the provenance, right? These different pieces of the custodial history take place at different times, so we can take our two dates, right? It was, A was found before 1941 and then was reused. Fragment B was found in 1956 and then later reused elsewhere. So we'll surround our dates with date. We can specify the type of date that we're talking about. So we're talking about the date that it was found. We can put a type attribute in our date element, and we can again use whatever value we want. I think here found is the smartest to use. But we also should note here, right, I'll just step back for 1 second. We see that there are two different pieces that we're talking about here, right? There's an A and a B. So what we could do, instead of having them all in one big blob of text in one paragraph, is we can divide these. Each of these can have their own history and provenance, right? So we can duplicate the element, right? Provenance is repeatable. So I can start with provenance, the type is found, and I'll assign it to A, right? So I'll say n equals A in the value, and then the first provenance here will only be information relating to the first fragment. In the second, we'll have information relating to the second fragment. Okay. We can again include the dates specifically for each, so we'll want to make that clear. And we can also get rid of our A and B, right? If we look here, we don't need that A and B anymore because that information has been moved to the markup, so we don't actually need it in the prose anymore. Okay. Sorry that the slide is getting progressively smaller. We're also adding progressively more information to it. So here, right, we've dealt with our find spots, and those are the top two provenances. But our objects have histories after they've been found, right? They've been moved, they have been seen in different places, et cetera, et cetera. So what if we want to talk about the last time something was seen? Well, we will put a new provenance element. And here we'll not say type is found because we're not talking about the find spot, but we'll say that we're talking about it being seen. So we'll say type equals observed, right? And in terms of our history of the object, we could say A is now in the Cyrene Museum, B is still at its find spot. Okay. But again, we can start adding more descriptive information to this to have a fuller sense of what is going on in the history of the object. So we can put a referring string again to our authority list if we have one, so we can define the Cyrene Museum. We can define the particular find spot here, right? If we look at our kind of reference string here points to the same place that it did up here, right? And as it did up here in the original place element. We can also do what we did previously and subdivide this, right? We don't necessarily need to have that kind of blob of text saying A is here, B is here. We can subdivide this and we can do a provenance for the first, right? Here, so provenance type observed n equals A and a provenance type observed n equals B, so that we can subdivide this. And we're in doing this, we're kind of enhancing our precision and making it a bit more indexable and manipulable by the machine, right? It's a little hard sometimes to, if you have just a lovely like wall of text that would make sense in a print edition, it doesn't really work as well in the digital context, right? So we can work on this kind of subdivision, and we can do this because of the way that the provenance element is structured and defined. Okay, if I want to talk about where it is right now, the way to define where the object lives right now is actually not necessarily down in the history and the provenance. You can include in there that maybe something was transferred, right? But if you do want to define the specific repository of an object, we're actually going to go back up in the header to a slightly different section. We're going to go up to the manuscript identifier section, all the way at the top of MS Desk. It's really one of the first things you hit when you are going through a file. And under the MS identifier, the manuscript identifier element, we'll have the repository where we'll say, okay, this is where it lives today. And we can also give, say, the catalog number at a museum or other repository, and we'll put that as the ID number, the idno element. All of this will be up in the MS identifier. Again, we might have something in history saying, how it got to this repository, but if you do want to say where it is today, what you do is you put that in the repository element that lives up in the MS identifier.
Can I just add something very quickly to that?
Oh, yes. Yeah, please, go ahead.
The repository also may not actually be the geographical location of the object. The repository is the administrative ownership or management of the object. It is who assigns it an inventory number, who is responsible for it. So it may still be in situ, many miles away on a mountainside, but the museum owns it. And so the museum is the repository in that sense. So that's another sense in which sometimes repository and present location can be different from each other. Very often, of course, original place, find place, current location, repository are all the same thing, but sometimes they can differ, and this is another way in which they can differ.
Yeah, and actually, I think to kind of build off that, one kind of thing that might help us see that a little bit here is when we're describing who has seen the inscription or when somebody saw it and where. What we can do potentially if we want to describe autopsy or something like that, like I was saying that X person saw it in person, we can specify that kind of information in a provenance element. And what we'll potentially see there is that the example here, right? Just walk through it very briefly, right? So we'll say that the provenance of this object was observed, right? It was an observation. The subtype we can define as autopsy. And then we'll give a string of dates when somebody saw it. We can have more information within this provenance element, though, as we saw with some of the others, and we can specify X person saw this object, and we can say where realistically, right? So it can drive home the fact that the object is still today when somebody can see it, not in exactly the place of the repository, if that makes sense. If we have excuse me, if we have locations mentioned in the text, it actually is going to work somewhat similarly to the way that we've described some of the information here, in the sense that so in our short example here, right, Apo Syria, so from Syria, what we'll do is we'll wrap the place in a place name element, and again, we are in text transcription here, so just keep that in mind. And from there, we can add more information about it. If we want to put in, say, a reference to an authority list, something like Pleiades again, we'll do exactly what we did before, where if we're pointing to an external list, we'll put ref and then a link to that external authority list. Just very, very, very briefly, I've mentioned authority lists once or twice, so I'll just say 2 words about them by way of conclusion here. We can link to really any kind of authority list, either ones that we've generated, XML lists that we create that contain all of the values relevant to our corpus that we're working on, our information, or we can point to external authority lists. I've mentioned the Pleiades gazetteer a couple times now. Or geonames or something like that. We can point to those. And what that might look like, again, is something like this. So if in our internal authority list, we are defining a place, right, we would give it an XML ID. And this is where that value is coming from when we were looking at a few of the previous slides where, it had, xlist.xml, number sign, and then an XML ID. Number, that's where we're defining those. So we can do that. Alternatively, if we are going to point out to external authority lists, we can use the URLs there and attach them to refs. Just one thing to note is that this slide isn't exactly the way that you would be doing it in your markup of a single inscription, right? This is a little bit more, kind of working on authority lists generally. All that I'm trying to show here is that, right, this is how we would construct, say, what an internal authority list value looks like, and then where our external authority list values come from. Okay, so I think that is all I had to say on location.
Great. Yeah, so one thing is we've talked a couple of times about marking things up in the text, which wasn't the primary goal of this session. I should add that in a couple of weeks, we'll have a session on named entity recognition, which specifically is the process of, usually automatically when we call it named entity recognition, but it's the same process if we do it manually, of identifying strings in a text that refer to real world things, such as places, people, dates, objects, that sort of thing. So we'll go a bit more into detail on that. And in particular, 2 weeks after that, when we then talk about web annotation, we'll see examples of places within texts being annotated with links to things like player IDs and geonames and so forth. So we'll come back to some of those features. So this has been just a useful sort of precursor to that. Yes, I'm going to talk very briefly then about the physical description of an object. For the purposes of an epigraphic or papyrological edition, we often talk about the physical description of various features of an object, and Scott mentioned this at the beginning. We talk about the object itself, such as its condition, its material, its dimensions, and so forth. We can talk about the text field and about the letters and the hands within that. So I'm just going to focus on the object for the next few slides. So there's this element within your manuscript description, within your TEI header, which is the physdesk, the physical description element. And a physical description element might look something like this. As an overview, it will have within it will have an object description, which includes the support and the layout, and it may also then have a hand description in there. So when we're talking about the physical description of the object itself, and it's worth noting that it doesn't need to be an inscribed object for us to make this sort of description of it. You could describe a completely text-free object as well in this context. But we put that within the support description, and we have then a support, and there could be multiple supports, right? You could have an inscription spread across multiple objects in some sense. And so within the support element, we can tag various pieces of information within that. We can tag the material, so the word, we can either have a span of text, as in this example, or we could have this spread out slightly more database-like with structure. But if in either case, you would tag the material of the object using this material element. You might tag the type of object itself using an object type element. And you might also want to tag the dimensions of the object, for example. And there's a dimensions element which has a whole bunch of attributes within it, width, height, depth, but you can also tag things like diameter and other things if it's an irregularly shaped object. And just note that that in the plain text we have the dimensions expressed as you would want them to be human readable. In the XML, when we've tagged it as dimensions, this is tagged to be computer readable, to be machine readable. So information like that little W and maybe an X in between them to show that that these are dimensions. Those things are left out, and those things might be added in your edition, but they don't belong in the XML markup here. Just a note: if you have a text that's in multiple parts, that has different information about each part, you can either do, if it's relatively straightforward, you can do what Scott showed with the 2 parts of an object that have different provenances, and you can just split the provenance there. But you can also do something slightly more intricate, which is that have your MS desk element, your manuscript description, divided into multiple MS parts, manuscript parts, that each of which can be given a number or an identifier, and can contain all of the information that that the MS desk can. So each part can have its own identifier, it can have its own repository, it can have its own history, and it can have its own physical description of the kind we've been looking at. If all of your parts have one thing in common, then that part, so they say they all have the same identifier and they all have the same history, but they have different physical descriptions, then you can put the identifier and the history directly inside the MS desk, and only the parts that differ for the different fragments or parts within the MS part element, the nested MS part elements. So that's I'm really sort of skimming over the surface of this, but if you want to say, part A has this and part B has that, you don't need to duplicate everything in order to be able to say that. So I think, yes, that was the last thing I wanted to say about the object. Back to Scott for the text field itself.
Yes, great. So if we've given a kind of general overview of the object itself, what we may also want to talk about now is describing the area in which there is writing on the text. And what we'll do is we will focus here on the layout description, the layout desk element, and the kind of layout elements that live within that. So here, just to again give a sense of what we're talking about here, is a kind of human readable output, right? So what we're interested in here is not the description. That was the kind of first piece that we just talked about with Gabby, but the text here, right, where it says inscribed on the facade above the door in a sunk rectangular panel, and then we are given some dimensions there. What we are doing there is we're giving description about the actual field of writing. And what we'll do is we would include that whole bit in the layout desk inside layout elements. Now, we can have multiple iterated layouts within. So if there are multiple spaces where there is writing on our object, so we could say layout n equals 1, and then that's our first description, right? So on the facade above the door, etc. But if we have a second area or a third area, right, we can just keep adding layout elements. It's something that is repeatable within the layout desk for as many fields of writing as you might need. And if you have a kind of fairly complex text or inscription or manuscript or what have you, you may actually need multiple layouts depending on your author's proclivities. Okay, so again, we can come back to the layout in question here. So we have a single layout, but what we might want to do is we also might want to specify something about how our text was executed within the layout, that is to say, how it was written. So we can mark the inscribed piece here with a referring string with an RS element and say, okay, the type of reference that we're making is about its execution, so we could include that information. And if we are going to want to point to a constrained list, you can either have a kind of, again, like we did with locations, an internal authority list, or if you want to have an external list, the Eagle Network has a pretty robust vocabulary for writing and different kinds of ways of executing inscriptions on texts. So we can include that here, and we have our value constrained. Other things that we might want to include, we might want to include the dimensions, which we can mark just like we did in the object description, like Gabby pointed out. So we can take our dimensions, wrap them in a dimensions element, and we can break it down again in the way that Gabby pointed out to make it more machine readable rather than human readable. So we can get rid of our WXH, right, our little width by height, and mark it like so. We can also specify the unit up here. Different projects may, and different corpora, if you're working off a corpus, may give this information differently. So do be sure to be specific there. So again, just to kind of briefly summarize, in the layout desk, you will put information about how the text is arranged on your object. If there are multiple snippets or sections of your text that are ordinated differently, you can use multiple layout elements to do so. If you want to include information about how it's been written within each piece of layout, you can use an RS element with the type of execution. And again, we can include our dimensions and mark them up in a way that is more machine readable than what we might have in our in our kind of blob of text. So with that in mind, though, and thinking a little bit about execution and how things are written, I think I'll turn back over to Gabby once more to tell us a bit more about what we're going to do when we want to talk about how it was written and the actual handwriting itself.
Great, thanks, Scott. Yeah, so it's sometimes not very clear the distinction between the description of the text and the description of the handwriting. But I think what Scott has pointed out is you're talking about the text zone, and here we're talking about the lettering itself and comments that you can make that might give us more information about who did the writing, for example. So if for example, we had paleographical information, you might be able to extract dating information from the hands and so forth. That's what belongs in this hand description, which is here in the overview of the physical description that we've been following for the last couple of sections. So the hand description can contain one or more hand notes, okay, as before. So here is an example of a hand description under letters in an edition, and I've linked to which edition this is. It says the date, it says a dimension, it says some description, and then it has some specific information about particular symbols within that. So again, we can encode that just as a string of text inside of the hand note, and again, hand notes could be repeated as we see if one piece of text has been written either by several different scribes, or even if all by the same person, but clearly on different visits and different dates and so forth. You might be able to tell by the ink or by changes to the cutting on an inscription. But if we've got a single one or within each one, we might also tag some of this other information. I normally wouldn't tag the date inside the hand note, just because that date is likely to be tagged somewhere else if it's useful. So if this is giving us information about the original date, that'll be tagged in ORIC date. So what we have in here is a slightly different kind of date information. When we say this hand looks like 1st century BC hand, that's not quite the same thing as saying the origin of this text is the 1st century BC, because you could have a text written in a 1st century BC hand, which is absolutely certainly known to be dated on some other criteria to a particular date, either within or maybe even not within the 1st century BC. You could tag it, obviously, but I'm just saying I normally wouldn't. You can tag this dimension. What this normally means is the letter heights, and this is probably an average letter height rather than because they're unlikely to be completely uniform. And note that conventionally we give the height of the letters but not the width. So in a sense, the dimensions have been getting fewer dimensional as we've been going along. We had the 3-dimensional object, the 2-dimensional text field, and now we're only given the single dimension of the height of the letters. Other information in here that might appear is less likely to be tagged unless you want to refer out to things and point out to things or tag things for highlighting or something. The height element that we've just seen, this is like other elements with numeric values and similar in some ways to date that we saw earlier, can have various attributes to help make it more machine readable. So we can give it a unit attribute, as Scott pointed out. When we say that the height is 0.005, what does that actually mean? Well, in this case, it means 0.005 of a meter, which I guess is half a centimeter, which is it's not always entirely intuitive that that's what 0.005 would mean. We can give it a value if that value is not already numerical, or if it's not always numerical, just to make it more machine readable. You can also give an estimated range, that is at least at most. So we can say, I'm pretty sure that the letter heights are between X and Y. Or we can give an observed range from and to, which is slightly different from at least at most, where we say all the letters fall between this height and that height. So an omicron is tiny, but a phi is really big, and you can give both dimensions in there. And we can also give precision, a precision attribute to say precision low, if that value or any of the other numerical attributes on there are uncertain or are circa, rather, not uncertain if they're imprecise. So the sorts of things that you might want to tag in there is information about paleographical features. So you might want to use the glyph element to tag individual special characters that you're describing in here. You might want to use the foreign tag. You might want to encode the language or script if you want to say specific things about different languages in use, or to use features of international encoding as part of your description of the letters. You might also comment on ligatures, numerals, symbols, which you may or may not feel the need to tag in this piece of description, because a lot of this encoding will indeed be in the transcription itself rather than in the hand note. And you might also talk about uncertainty about where one hand ends and another hand begins if there's multiple hands in this text. So these are sorts of things that you're more likely to describe than you are to tag per se. So that's sort of an overview of what we do with the description of the hand itself, the hand note. We can in a minute talk a little bit about the exercise that we're proposing, but I guess maybe first we can discuss some slightly bigger sort of issues. We'll invite any questions from those of you watching live. Please do post your questions on live on the YouTube chat. We don't have Monica with us today, who normally does ask quite incisive questions at this point. So we'll have to ask ourselves questions unless you join in. So please do. I will start with a question which I'm not necessarily insisting that you answer this, Scott. You could throw it back to me and make me answer it if you prefer. But this is a question which we often get asked, and it's easy to have a glib answer to. So I think it's worth stopping and thinking about, which is that when you're tagging the text, the transcribed text in EpiDoc, as we did 2 weeks ago, it's easy to see how there's not really any other way to encode that information, right? You've got the Leiden system used to describe the text, and you replace that with EpiDoc tags, and there's not a way to break that up in any different way. With this sort of information we've seen here, we sometimes find ourselves using words like, for this field, we put this here. What we're talking about is a database. We could describe a lot of the information that's in all of the things we've been talking about for the last hour in a database rather than in an XML file. And some people would prefer to do that because they're used to databases, and learning XML is an extra thing to learn. So why do we do this in EpiDoc XML rather than in a database?
I mean, my instinctive answer to that, and correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, is that I think the doing it in XML, it kind of inherently has greater flexibility to it than the database structure, even if you are going to not necessarily mimic, but have a more kind of database structured XML file. I think you mentioned this earlier, and I know that at the Epigraphy project, where I do most of my XML work, we do actually have a slightly more structured system about our files. But I do think it does kind of, to come back to the original question, having an XML database, or excuse me, XML structure rather than database structure, kind of, I think lets us build in a bit more of, kind of allowing us to show the nuances of an individual object or a series of objects that relate to one another. I think we saw that in dealing with the kind of longish provenance example that we looked at, where there's multiple pieces to it, and we can either, if we're doing a database, right, if we're treating it as one object, then we somehow have to kind of break that up in an awkward fashion, or lose some of the nuance of this is actually 4 objects per se, but not actually, separate in the sense that they originally were the same object. So I think you can lose gradations and things like that if you are working with just a kind of rigid database structure. as opposed to working with XML. But I mean, I'd be curious if you agree or kind of have a different take on it.
No, I do agree. I think that is very important. The flexibility and the ability to capture complex information that would lead to a very complex database if you were to build a database to handle that sort of thing. Databases can handle that sort of thing. Databases, you know, if we were encoding archaeological information on non-inscribed objects, you know, most likely that would end up in a database somewhere, or in a linked open data system, which is just a graph database in another form. But they become more and more complex the more you do that. Right. There's another reason for why we might want to why we not just might, but why we do, right? Both Scott and I do encode object description and history in EpiDoc in several different projects, which is that that same XML file is where we've got our transcribed text, which I think we've made a fairly compelling case is the only real way to encode an inscribed text, a transcribed text, in a deeply rich machine readable way. It's in the same file that we have our bibliography, which again, you can put bibliography in a database, but it's a mess. It's really cumbersome. Even if a lot of that is done for you automatically, it's a lot more cumbersome than just tagging one or two features that you need for that bibliography in an XML file. And having these things all in the same place, having the text, the description, the commentary, the translation, the history and description of the object, all of this information and metadata, all in a single XML file for a given object which is published. And I guess this is, I guess what I'm coming to is this is the nature of epigraphy. Which is that epigraphy is not just a text discipline, it's not just an archaeological discipline, but it's a bit of both. And it's a lot of both. I mean, and it involves incorporating both and integrating both in a pretty complex way. And XML is a really good way of handling that.
Yeah. Just looking at the comments very, very quickly, we do have a question just to kind of, if we could define database structure as opposed to what we're talking about with.
That is a good question, and it's a particularly useful question because we have each in the last couple of minutes stumbled over calling XML a database when we were trying to make a distinction between XML and databases. So it is clearly not very precise language. Where we're talking about database, we're talking about tabular relational database, or for that matter, graph database format. So this is if you were using something like FileMaker Pro or Microsoft Access, or even just a spreadsheet, an Excel file, where you've got all of your data is tabular. So down one side, if you're picturing it as a table, down the left-hand side of the table, you've got the various records. So, you know, record 1, record 2, record 3, and along the top, you have all the various fields that each record has information about. And so you'd say inscription 1, find place, you know, original location, modern location, repository, inventory number, and all that sort of information in columns. As you can see, that's a lot less flexible than the XML structure we've got. Obviously, databases aren't quite that simple. Then the databases are a lot more complex than a single spreadsheet. But so you have multiple tables. So you have one table for locations. So you can attach multiple locations, each with a different category or tag to a single object in the main table. So you can do this sort of multiple thing, but databases then become very, very complex. We can all picture a spreadsheet and how you would put 50 inscriptions with 12 pieces of information about each inscription into a spreadsheet like that. But if you've got a complex database that can handle all of that information, what you're actually talking about is 30 spreadsheets with relationships between them pointing to each other quite richly. And so you've got software, so you can't do that in a spreadsheet anymore. You've got software like, you know, Microsoft Access or FileMaker or various other databases, you know, MySQL or other things that handle all that for you. Do you think I've answered the question of what is a database, or can you put that more succinctly?
I think that's pretty much covers what the kind of big picture thing is. I mean, I often tend to in kind of more metaphorical terms, think of it as like, databases tend to be a kind of series of relatively flat kind of structures that can interrelate to one another. But you need to have the different pieces that interrelate to one another, whereas an XML file is actually not so flat, but rather deep. And it's, I'm not trying to like, diminish the kind of relations that one can construct with databases. But I think that you can have a greater depth of information more easily and more readily using an XML file system, as opposed to a kind of more rigidly constrained database structure or system like you described. So
yeah, I think that's right. I think flexibility is key to that. You can start off tagging a file or a text or a document or a set of information in an XML file, and you may not have decided when you start exactly what you're going to include, but you can just add tags for the various bits when you get to them. And especially if you're using something like the TEI, which EpiDoc is based on, that a lot of people have been thinking about for a long time, there's lots of options for you of things you might want to tag. In order to capture that same information in a database, you kind of have to know what you're going to encode before you start, because you have to set the database up in order to accept that information. And it's worth saying that there is not a conflict between whether databases are better than XML or vice versa, or said conflict of which we're on one side and there are other people on the other side. I don't think anybody would make either of those statements. I think databases are better for certain kinds of data capture, specifically for very structured data. And XML is much more useful for when you need that flexibility, for when you're dealing with text, and for, as with epigraphy, when you have to integrate that text and that more structured information alongside one another. It's also worth saying that when we say XML, we're really talking about Text Encoding Initiative XML, because databases are also in XML. Right, there is XML behind the scenes. It's part of the software behind most things. So just in the interest of being very concrete, we're talking about Text Encoding Initiative XML as one way of structuring data.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of Gabby hit on something really important too. I mean, we're not advocating for one against the other, but what we are saying is that it depends a bit on your research question ultimately as to which is going to be most useful to you in a given context.
Yeah. And so again, we were using XML as shorthand for TEI XML, and we were using database as shorthand for a carefully structured, relatively flat relational database structure. The database also means more things. If you have a collection of XML files in a file system somewhere, that's in a sense a sort of database.
Yeah.
And very often for publishing, people will take a bunch of XML files and other data and put it into something like an exist database for publication and for searching. That's probably more of an answer than you expected for that question, but what your question really showed up was that we're using language imprecisely, and so it took us this long to define what we really meant. So that was really useful. Thank you for asking that. Any other questions from the audience? Maybe while we're waiting, then we could talk very briefly about the exercise that we suggest you do for this. Those of you who were here 2 weeks ago, or who watched the previous session on text encoding with for the text transcription field, you will have tried out an exercise encoding the text of a few inscriptions. So feel free to take those same inscriptions, because you've been looking at those, and encode the descriptive and historical information of the kind that Scott and I have been talking about for the last hour in the EpiDoc file. On the session page, we've also given you a link to the EpiDoc guidelines, to more EpiDoc training videos, and to a quick reference sheet for description and history, which gives you a summary of a lot of what we've talked about and a few other things. If you haven't already done that exercise, or if you'd like to do something else, feel free to use the exercise section from the previous session from 2 weeks ago to find some inscriptions to work on, and it has some inscriptions in Greek and Latin and in English if you prefer, and also papyri and other kinds of objects written on ancient text written on ancient objects. Or if there's any other inscription or papyrus or other inscribed object you would like to work on, feel free to use that. Go to your local graveyard and measure a monument and encode as much information as you can about that in EpiDoc. That would also be fine. Be respectful if it's actually in a graveyard, obviously, but because what we're talking about here is not the textual parts, but the physical description and contextual information about it, it doesn't particularly have to be an inscribed object. You could try and describe any archaeological or heritage object or building even in the TI header of an EpiDoc file and see how that works. So try that out. Discuss it with your classmates and your tutors if you have them. Or feel free to get in touch with anyone in the EpiDoc community or the SunoikisisDC community, or there's an issue tracker on this on the GitHub thing, and post examples of what you've been doing, ask questions, etc. I think that's the idea for the exercise. Anything to add to that, Scott?
No, I think that's really really covers the basis of it. I mean, again, remember that what we're very much interested in is what you see when you're looking at the object and how you can attempt to define the object without worrying about what is written on it. So again, focusing on just things like the dimensions, whatever kind of history you can of it, things like that. Is really what the primary concern is here. So I mean, if it helps to actually separate yourself from the from worrying about, well, this is an inscribed object, I care what the text says, pick something in a language you just don't know, or pick something without writing on it, because really what we do want to focus on is what you see when you're looking at the physical object.
Yeah. And there may be things that you want to record that we haven't told you about and that you can't very easily find on the quick reference sheet, in which case you can either skip those, or if you really feel like finding out more, look in more depth in the EpiDoc guidelines, look in more depth in the TEI guidelines, use Google or whatever and try and find out more, or bring those questions to as I say, colleagues or tutors or whatever, if you have access to those.
Yeah.
There's another question in the live chat asking if we could explain the use of the foreign tag, which I think was just mentioned briefly today.
Yeah, that's part of that note.
So the foreign tag, I'm sort of going to explain this backwards. The foreign tag is a tag on which you can attach information about language and script. Specifically, you can use International Standards Organization language codes or script codes to say something about the text within the foreign tag. And the reason you would say it on a foreign tag rather than just on the division that contains the entire text, so if you've got an entire text that's written in Greek, written in Latin characters, for example, you can say language equals Greek written in Latin characters, right? GRC for ancient Greek, LATN for the Latin script. And you're saying that about the entire thing. The reason for using the foreign tag is if part of your text is either in a different language or potentially a different script than the rest. So if I've got an entire text that's written in Latin, I'll just say XML lang equals la for Latin in the on the text division. But if there's a Greek word in the middle of it, I'll say foreign language equals Greek, just for that one word. And then I'll close foreign, and we understand that when foreign has closed, we've gone back to Latin. Is that everything useful we could say about foreign?
I think so. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is that, again, we're using foreign in a case where it's a deviation from the main primary language of our text. And usually we've described that somewhere else in the file, actually. You know, I think you can do it in hand, I think is where we were kind of pointing towards it a bit. You could do it, I've seen it done further up in the MS desk, actually, where you define main language of an object or something like that. So basically what's going to have happened is that at some point, probably you will have said, like, you know, this inscription or this letter or this, you know, whatever you have is written in X language. When you want to indicate that there is a code switch, right, then you'll mark it as foreign.
And it's worth mentioning that you would tag it in your text. I mean, you can also use foreign in your commentary or in anywhere else. So the reason for tagging it is because you want to do something with it, right? Whether that's indexing or searching or putting it in a different font or, you know, making it bigger or doing something else with it. That's why you would tag it. So if you're going to tag something as foreign, you just want to think, am I doing this for the sake of it, or is there a reason that would be useful to tag as foreign? So for example, in the hand description, you may not want to use the same font for your English commentary that you're writing and the Aramaic script on a stone that you're editing. You might want to put that in a different font because you know, it looks better in certain fonts. So when you're saying in your hand note, you know, the letter, and then you print an Aramaic letter, is larger than you'd expect, that letter you might tag as foreign and give it a language of Aramaic so that the computer knows to put it in your favorite Aramaic font, which it otherwise would put it in, you know, in Arial like the rest, and Aramaic letters look a bit rubbish in Arial or whatever. I don't know if they do. I don't want to besmirch the Arial font, but you know, so likewise in the Greek text, if you want to tag one word as being in Latin, that may be because you want to, you know, specify to your system that when you say search in Greek, it won't also search for that Latin word. So that sort of thing. So you tag it if you've got a reason to tag it, not just always. Did we want to say something about publishing? What we might do with this data? How we might transform this this complex data, which is not human readable. Well, I mean, it is human readable. I mean, you and I are humans, and we can look at a piece of EpiDoc and see what it says. But most people would prefer not for this to be their primary way of consuming an epigraphic edition, right? Did we want to say a little bit about what benefit there might be to publishing it from this format, for example?
Sure. I mean, so thinking in terms of something like we have our files, we can use you know, either kind of homebrew XSLT or something like the FS publisher to produce the edition and then kind of go from there. I mean, I think this is something that I think we've actually kind of touched on a bit when you and I have kind of, you know, danced around things like indexing and services like that, right? So that on the one hand, having all of the information there marked up correctly in a machine readable format, yes, allows us to fit in you know, what is ultimately like a kind of audience oriented human readable way, and you know, put the information in the right place and look great. But that's not necessarily something that you know, we absolutely would have to use TEI XML to do, right? Again, I think we mentioned this when we were responding to the question about databases, right? You can do that with databases to a degree, but the kind of thing that I think that you may have been touching on a bit is the kind of ability to do things with our data via kind of indexing and kind of other related tools, thanks to having prepared it in the way that we have, prepared data with the various pieces of TEI XML markup, right? So again, to kind of, I mean, just to keep riffing off the foreign element question, right? You know, if you are working with, say, you know, kind of bilingual Greek and Latin funerary inscriptions, right? And what you're really hoping to do with your database, once you've assembled it, your XML files and whatnot, is to find places where, you know, formulaic language has code switched or something like that. You know, that can be kind of hard to do with other database structures or things like that. But with the XML files and kind of working with them and publishing them through the various, you know, tools that are maintained, like FS, which has the kind of robust indexing built in. You know, you can find all of that pretty easily, and it can help direct you towards you know, resolving different research questions and things like that. Same thing for you know, potentially working with the provenance elements. I mean, this is something that I know is a kind of ongoing discussion, you know, internally at my own project, and I think more broadly that you know, we can use the XML structures to help work towards you know, building networks of where things were found and how the texts themselves relate, while, you know, working that way, and then the kind of robust indexing and things like that you can generate off of this kind of machine readable format is actually, you know, quite powerful in that sense. But I mean, that's my kind of, like, on some level, myopic view, because these are the things that I find the most useful about working with texts in this format. So I don't know if you have anything to add or a different perspective on that.
I think the only example I wanted to show is, actually, we talked way back at the beginning of this. I think, Scott, you showed this slide,
Yeah.
which had two snippets, so one of an epigraphic edition and one of a papyrological edition, which you showed as in a way the contrast to EpiDoc, right? I mean, these are what you'd expect to see in a conventional edition. So you know, this inscription 548 is a fragment, and there's all the various information about it, the description, the text, the letters, etc. And this papyrological edition that has various information about it in there as well. It's a little bit hard to see because it's so small, but both of these screenshots that we've got on here actually are taken from projects that publish via EpiDoc. So in both cases, there is an EpiDoc file behind this information, and that has been transformed into this and published on the web, or in some cases published on paper, but transformed from the EpiDoc. So the information is there, but there's more information in there. So, for example, you see, I don't know how well you can see, but Leptis magna there under find spot is in a slightly different color from the rest. That's because it's a hyperlink, and you can click on that and you can go to a map which shows you where Leptis magna is, and drilling down within that, you can see all the inscriptions that are from Leptis magna, because all of them have been tagged with Leptis magna in this way. So the tag Leptis magna does three different things. One is it prints the word Leptis magna on the page. Two is it allows you to create a hyperlink to the map. And three, it allows the map, or it allows the code that generated that map to say, find me all the inscriptions that got that tag saying Leptis magna, and put them here on the map so you can find your way back to them in that direction. So the creating a human readable version of the text is only one of the things you do from this. If you didn't, if it were the only thing you did, then why wouldn't we just use Word or something, maybe something nicer than Word, to create a printable version and put it on paper, or put it on HTML on the page? If that was all we were doing, then yeah, what would we be gaining? But as Scott says, things like indexing, things like you know, processing it for other, you know, statistical or grouping or sorting or whatever, are things that you can do in addition to reading from it. Okay, I don't think I can think of any other questions to ask us. Anything in the last couple of minutes that you think we could usefully talk about, Scott?
I mean, the things that I would have wanted to bring up, actually, you could have walked me into in the kind of like last leading question. So,
Okay. Cool. Okay. In that case, just to remind people that next week we have another session on computational linguistics, where we'll be talking about research with tree banks. And tree banks, for those to whom that's not a household name, are a way of annotating morphological and syntactic, that is to say, the grammatical information embedded in a word and the grammatical relationship between words in a sentence. So annotating that sort of linguistic information across text. This is not going to be a session on how to annotate morphological and syntactic information, but what to do when you have a large body of text that has been annotated in that way. What sorts of linguistic research you can do with tree-banked texts. That's on the more computational linguistics side, and a week after we're talking about named entity recognition, which is sort of a crossover between the linguistic approach and the text encoding approach that we've been talking about in just by accident in alternate weeks so far this semester. So please do join us again for those sessions, and thank you again for coming and for your questions. See you all soon.